Hi there, my name is Halme-Tuomisaari and I am Associate Professor in Human Rights Studies at Lund University. In this video, I continue my series of instructions on how to write a thesis and also how to finish them. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. So this video is called Putting Things in Their Places, and it really is suited for the time when you have around 2 weeks before you have to submit. And I will be going over the basic things of how to make your thesis structured and pleasurable and easy for a reader to access. I will be going over what goes in the introduction, the literature overview and theory, analysis, discussion, and conclusions. Now, you may have a slightly different set of guidelines from your own institution, where it's possible that you have separate chapters for methods and theory, ethical considerations. Follow all of them. So what I want to say will not trump that, but you can also use your judgment. Nevertheless, these are the main parts that you will have, and you can adjust your institutional instructions accordingly. Let's get started. So the metaphor that I would hope that you can keep in mind is to think of your thesis as an onion, however, evidently with a lot less tiers. Often there may be some tiers involved, as maybe many of you have discovered. Thesis work is intensive and it's a very personal process. However, I don't want to have this kind of a tiersome metaphor here. So let's imagine that the onion has been really nicely simmered in butter or whatnot. However, the main point is to think of how your thesis is layered. So you go deeper in the layers as your text progresses. So don't offer everything right up front. Think about how you can keep the suspense and go deeper in your analysis and argumentation as your text progresses. So what goes in your introduction? Think of your introduction really as setting the table. So when a person walks into a nice restaurant or a beautiful dinner party, what they will see is how the table has been set. Now, this, of course, is a way of making things visually pleasing, but it's not just for that reason that we have table settings. Instead, it actually is a way of conveying a lot of information. So what you get from a table setting is a description of the course of the meal that will follow. You will be able to see how many forks are there, how many spoons, how many knives. Is there a steak knife? Is there a fish knife? Is there a bowl of soup? Is there something else, some kinds of things that you think maybe are used for eating lobsters? How many different kinds of glasses are there? Is there one for sparkling wine? Is there one for white wine? Is there one for red wine? Is there one for dessert wine? So with all of that information, you are able to navigate the meal that will follow. If someone then all of a sudden comes in with a large pint of beer, you may not, especially if you're not a beer drinker, you may not feel particularly pleased because you may think, well, no, wait, I had this plan and the meal all mapped out in my head. What is this pint of beer doing here? So you do not want to have the reader experiencing the wrong kinds of surprises in your thesis. And that would mean that they would encounter an entirely new set of data, an entirely different method, or new theoretical approaches that you have not introduced them to them in when you have been setting the table. However, the most important thing to remember is that you do not start serving the courses during this introductory phase. So think about it as if you were inviting the chef to the table to describe the meal that will follow, but you will not be having the chef or the servants or waiters coming in to deliver fish courses or steak. Instead, you just want to have a description of what will follow, and then the actual courses will come in later. So there's a checkup list for things that you want to find in an introduction. So every single study should always start with a sentence that says, this is a study about. It doesn't always have to be with these exact words. And maybe sometimes you want to start with a quote or something, but somewhere very early on, there should be a section where a reader can go to, and they will find a description of, this is a study about, followed by 2 or 3 sentences of what the thesis really is about. And these sentences can feel quite difficult to write because you may feel that I don't know how to end these sentences. I know this is a study about, but what is it really a study about? That's also one of the reasons why I suggest that you would push yourself to write them. And even if you rewrite these sentences every single day between now and when you submit your thesis, that will be useful, because every single time you do rewriting, it pushes you one step closer to actually knowing what your thesis is about. After that, you will want to have 2 or 3 pages of general introduction. So this will mean a summary of the themes that you are studying, a very brief description of the context, and then some explanation of why this topic is relevant. So what kind of relevance does it have for ongoing societal debate? What kind of relevance for ongoing scholarly debate? Why do we need to know what is in the thesis, and why do we want to read it as readers? So motivate the reader, really draw them in these pages. You want to be sure that the reader is more excited about your thesis after having read these first pages than rather than being discouraged. After that, you want to have a summary of your research questions in the introduction. So the reader will want to know what is it concretely that you are studying. You will also want to have a description of your data. And it is really important that the reader sees concretely what is your primary data in the introduction. You will also want to have some kind of an understanding of methods and theory. It's possible that your thesis instructions suggest that you include a more detailed description of these in a separate chapter. Whether it's going to be in the introduction or a separate chapter, you nevertheless will want to highlight or summarize what kind of methods you're using, have some literature there, and describe what it is that you will do with your primary data. You'll also want to give some understanding of what kind of a theory you will use. However, likely that also will be elaborated in a separate chapter. Also, one thing that goes in the introduction is background information. So you want to give the reader a sense of what is the context of the research questions that you are asking. The most important thing about your introduction is that you will not actually start engaging in analyses. You will not start to do a research overview there. You will not start theoretical discussions, and you will definitely not start with your analyses. If you have very clear ideas on what you conclude with, and by the time you are revising your introduction, of course, you know what your conclusions are, you can hint at them, but do not preempt your entire thesis by sharing all of your conclusions in detail in the introduction. Keep the reader sort of glued to the edge of their seat. Think again that you are writing a detective novel, and the reader will have to wait a little bit to get everything that you conclude in your conclusions. Okay, let's move on to literature overview and theory. Now, you can decide how to arrange it. Usually a good way to do it is in themes. So if you have started your literature overview, but by simply introducing individual scholars, try to think about rearranging them so that you have distinct themes and you connect scholars around these themes. However, remember that the focus is on the scholars. So in the literature overview, do not hide the scholars that you're talking of only into footnotes. Bring them to the text. Bring the scholars really close to the text. So I think it's a nice touch to have both the first and the last name of the scholars you discussed the first time you mentioned them. However, that's also a slight matter of preference. However, be consistent. If you want to mention what field they come from, if someone is a philosopher or a political theorist, then mention that for every single scholar that you have. If you feel that you don't have that information and it takes too much time for you to retrieve it, then just stick with the names. However, bring the scholars close to the reader. Ideally, have a few quotes from the reading itself, so that the reader can really see that you have done your reading. Remember, in the literature overview and theory section, there will be no introduction. So you're no more introducing, in this thesis, I will be doing this and this and this. The reader knows. We are done admiring the table setting, and now it's time to go to the courses. So no more introductions, no background information, no research questions. You do not add more research questions after the introduction. No analyses. Often one sees that there is a tendency, a temptation to start running ahead and starting to engage in some kind of analyses and discussion and conclusions already at the literature overview. You can write them while you are working on the literature review, but then rearrange the sections so that you take it where it really belongs, which is in the sections for discussion and conclusions. After that, we move to analyses, and this is really the highlight of your thesis. Often it's worthwhile to have a separate chapter or even several separate chapters for your analyses. This is really where you work with your primary data. And remember, this is the most, and we could actually say the only truly original part of your thesis, meaning that this is the kind of information that your readers will not be able to get from anywhere else. Of course, also your own analysis and engagement with scholarship is unique, but really bringing in your own primary data, whatever it consists of, constitutes the really truly original part of your thesis. Remember to give it space. And here I have written modulation. And for those who follow the Eurovision Song Contest, you will know what this means. So the song will start out, there'll be a nice chorus and lots of really flashy dance moves and lights and whatnot. But then after a while, and you may be all like, wow, this is really impressive. But after a while, things start to get a bit repetitive. And that is the moment when you boost up the volume and you add a modulation, which means you concretely take the tune to the next level. So think of this and give your analysis also some room to grow. So what I suggest that you do is that when you start your analysis section, it will only be you and your analysis, which means concretely that you bring in your data and you will show what kind of data you have, so a bit more description there at the start of the analysis section. And then if you are analyzing interviews, for example, think about whether you have certain themes. They could be the same themes, ideally, that you would have for your literature overview. And you can start to share your data under these themes. So you can concretely have a paragraph where you describe what will come, what kinds of things you're analyzing, and then you have a couple of quotes, and then again you analyze what you have seen and taken up from those quotes. So do not rush in to bring in all other scholars and theorists there. So give your analysis some space. Show to the reader how you have conducted your analysis. However, this is not the same thing as sharing your own analytical notes. So draw a distinction between what is sort of your own research process and what is the outcome of your analysis. However, still share with the reader what you have done. Then let's move on. Well, this is a checklist for analysis. So no introductions. So none of this in this study I see that actually quite a bit in the analysis chapter that one says, still repeats, okay, I will do this and this. No, the reader will know because you have done all of that introducing in the introduction. So do not continue with that. No new research questions. This is not only the equivalent of a pint of beer. This would be the same thing as saying, okay, you just finished the steak. Now here's the stew. And you're kind of like, no, I already had the main course. So you do not add new research questions here. You can think about them, but it will mean that you will edit your text so that you bring those questions into the introduction so that the reader is prepared for all the questions that you pose. Do not engage in a literature overview here. If you feel that you still have something that you need to explain or share of literature, edit and take that to the literature overview. You can offer some background information to contextualize your data further, but do keep most of it in the introduction. Will you include discussion in your analysis? Yes and no. We will talk of discussion in a moment, but there are two ways of doing that, and let's talk about that in a moment. No conclusions. So you do not jump ahead and draw final conclusions. Keep the suspense until the end. Remember that you still have lots of pages to go through. And if you throw in everything that you've got at the reader, well, not only, in the analysis chapter is there no room for modulation, but there's no room for your thesis to grow. So keep it nice and tight still. The reader will be impressed with your data and your analyses at the beginning, and then you need to add up the volume later. Discussion. So what do you do in the discussion? What does it really mean? Here you start to bring together your own analyses, earlier scholarship, and theory. And it really means that what you have concluded in your own analysis, That's your own research. Now you combine it with what others have been doing, and then you combine it further with theoretical frameworks and angles that give it this kind of a more abstract, general level of discussion. So you start to add layers. And this is also the reason why in your own analysis chapter, you do not bring everything in at once. Think that you first need to do your own research, and then you can engage in discussion with earlier scholarship. A discussion is not the same thing as you just sharing your views on what you think of your analyses. I sometimes see that as well. So whoever you have introduced to us in your literature overview, we don't have to encounter everyone in your discussion, but the key scholars that you have highlighted should make a reappearance. Otherwise, readers are wondering, okay, so where did everyone go? So you want to make sure that you are introducing people and theoretical approaches in that section for a reason. And that reason is that they will reappear in the discussion. You can organize your discussion in two different ways. You can either combine it, that let's say that you have your analysis chapter will be chapter 3. In 3.1, you have a particular theme. In 3.1.1, which means the start of that particular theme, it is only you and your analyses. And in 3.1.2, you start to bring in different earlier scholarship and then theoretical approaches as well. Now you can do the same with 3.2. You start out with a theme, it's just you and your analysis, and then you start to build up volume. You can also do it in a different way where you have only your own analyses in a particular chapter on analyses, and then you bring in all the other research in a separate chapter on discussion. So it's up to you. But think about going from the very specific, which is your own scholarship, to something that is a bit broader, which also brings in earlier scholarship and contextualizes your analyses, and then toward a more abstract level where you really also engage with theoretical discussion. Remember your own voice here in the discussion, even though I say that it's not just about you sharing your own thoughts. The purpose is that you are the author. So it should be a discussion that feels motivated. Do not be afraid to share your own conclusions, even though this is not fully the conclusion section, but your conclusions from your analyses. So your voice needs to be present there, but it's not a monologue. This is a conversation. That's why it's called a discussion. Again, no new analyses. So when you embark on the discussion, try not to mix the sections where you still are conducting analysis and then having a discussion. That can get a bit disorienting for a reader. Do not introduce new scholars or theories. So again, that will be the wrong kind of a surprise. Whoever is included in the discussion will be introduced in the literature overview and theory sections. Definitely no research questions or introductions, etc. Finally, conclusions, wrapping everything together. Here you start to leave other scholars behind a little bit. So you basically are starting to kind of get a bit of distance, and you're looking at your entire thesis from kind of afar. So you're looking at the general overview of, okay, so what all happened, what did we learn, and what can we conclude on the basis of that? Remind readers of what you asked at the start of your thesis and summarize what you discovered. And the other tip that I got from my professor is that you should start every thesis by saying, this is a study about, and you should conclude it by saying, on the basis of this study, it can be said. And this is a fantastic sentence because it means that you remind yourself all the time to cover your back against the accusation that you are making and drawing the kinds of conclusions for which you actually did not have data and you actually not have analyses. So when you remind the reader that you are only arguing on the basis of this study, you are covering your back against those kinds of accusations and critique. It is possible, and there are slightly different schools here. Some scholars think that there should be no new questions in the conclusions. I think differently. I think that possible conclusions can be new research questions and research topics with one S, sorry, that 2 S's there. So I think that research is an ongoing process, and this intellectual inquiry of ours will not only fully cease with any individual project or paper or book. So I think a successful conclusion of a research project can be that you end up with new questions. However, think of what feels right for you. If you're unsure, check with your supervisor and then see what you decide to do. This is not something that someone will fail you over. So if you end up introducing new questions, it's more a matter of stylistic preference, I would say. And here is a checkup list. So what to do to make sure that everything stays in its place is to print everything. As I've said, I'm not a great fan of printing things. We want to save our trees, but when you are finishing a large entity such as a thesis, it can be useful. So print everything. You know that I'm a sucker for highlighters, so get your highlighting markers out again and use different color for each section, just as we see here at the bottom. So you can use black for introduction, blue for literature overview, and so on, so forth and so forth. And you go over each section, each chapter. And if you see things that are actually yellow, which would mean analyses, in a blue card, which would mean literature overview, you simply edit it and change its place. So you organize things so that things are in their places. And sometimes this can be very subtle work. It can be that there is a sentence or a half a sentence that actually sort of moves over into the realm of conclusions. Be really sort of strict with yourself here. So make sure that you are very nice and organized, because it can be quite annoying for a reader if things just kind of flow all over the place. Think of the entity so that it moves on like a train on tracks. So every single cart has a particular task that it does for the thesis, and when things are in their places, the train keeps on moving neatly and nicely along. And then finally, with the familiar encouragement, good luck, and remember to enjoy the process. Even though certainly you will likely feel stressed out before a big deadline, it still is an enjoyment and a privilege to be able to engage with something that you hopefully have passion for. So remember to enjoy the process, and I am sure that you will do a great job.